Thank you, Will, for that entertaining oration. Another round of applause for Will Bailey. I am Karan Loda, and this is Luther Gatewood, and it is our honor and privilege to present to you today's keynote speaker, the Honorable Ben S. Bernanke.
A headline on the front page of the Wall Street Journal today reads, "Bernanke bolsters weak dollar." The story that follows discusses the pros and cons of Chairman Bernanke's recent speech aimed at improving the dollar's lackluster performance, a bold new move for a Federal Reserve chairman. But regardless of your feelings about his leadership of the Fed, it is hard to ignore the chairman's penchant to make difficult decisions and exercise political courage. During this trying time, Chairman Bernanke has been able to rely on the experience from his long and distinguished career, including over 2 decades working within the Federal Reserve System and a term as the chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors.
What Chairman Bernanke is perhaps less famous for, however, are his Cantabrigian roots. A member of the Harvard class of 1975, he, like 125 of us, spent his college years living in the shadows of Lowell House's beautiful blue bell tower, a denizen of the much less ostentatious, yet equally proud Winthrop House. In what was a sign of things to come, the young scholar graduated summa cum laude with an AB in economics before moving down the street to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he completed his PhD under the guidance of Professor Stanley Fischer.
In 1979, Chairman Bernanke began his career of enlightening future economists, teaching at Stanford University, MIT, and New York University, and finding a home in the ivy-lined walls of a New Jersey institution whose name we prefer not to mention. While at this supposedly prestigious university, Chairman Bernanke was the class of 1926 Professor of Economics and Public Affairs from 1994 to 1996, and the Howard Harrison and Gabriel Snyder Beck Professor of Economics and Public Affairs and Chair of the Economics Department from 1996 to 2002.
As you can tell from the length of those titles, he was a pretty big deal.
In 2002, he joined the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, just 4 years before he'd be sworn in as the chairman, assuming the prominent position previously held by Alan Greenspan. Since February 1st, 2006, when it comes to monetary policy, all eyes have been on Chairman Bernanke.
Given his accomplishments as a scholar, a policymaker, and above all, as a teacher, it is truly an honor to have Chairman Bernanke address us today. Please join Luther and me in welcoming him back to Harvard as he gives us one final lesson.
Hello, Harvard. It seems to me, paradoxically, that both long ago and only yesterday, I attended my own class day in 1975. I'm pleased and honored to be invited back by the students of Harvard. Our speaker in 1975 was Dick Gregory, the social critic and comedian who was inclined toward the sharp-edged and the satiric. Central bankers don't do satire as a rule, so I'm going to just try for a kind of interesting. When I attended class day as a graduating senior, Gerald Ford was president, and an up-and-coming fellow named Alan Greenspan was his chief economic advisor. Just weeks earlier, the last Americans remaining in Saigon had been evacuated by helicopters. On a happier note, the Red Sox were on their way to winning the American League pennant. I skipped classes to attend a game of the World Series against the Cincinnati Reds. As was their wont in those days, the Sox came agonizingly close before snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. On that score, as on others, disco music and pet rocks come to mind. Many things are better today than they were then. In fact, that will be a theme of my remarks. Although 1975 was a pretty good year for the Red Sox, it wasn't such a good year for the U.S. economy. Then, as now, we were experiencing a serious oil price shock, sharply rising prices for food and other commodities, and subpar economic growth. But I see differences between the economy of 1975 and the economy of 2008 that are more telling than the similarities. Today's situation differs from that of 33 years ago, in large part because our economy and society have become much more flexible and able to adapt to difficult situations and to new challenges. Economic policy making has improved as well, I believe, partly because we have learned some of the hard lessons of the past. Of course, I don't want to minimize the difficult challenges we currently face, and I will come back to some of these. But I do think that our demonstrated ability to respond constructively and effectively to past economic problems provides a basis for optimism about the future. I will focus my remarks today on two economic issues that challenged us in the 1970s and that still do so today: energy and productivity. These, obviously, are not the kinds of topics chosen by many recent Class Day speakers: Will Ferrell, Ollie G., or Seth MacFarlane, to name a few. But then the class marshals presumably knew what they were getting when they invited an economist. Because the members of today's graduating class and some of your professors were not yet born in 1975, let me begin by briefly surveying the economic landscape of the mid-1970s. The economy had just gone through a severe recession during which output, income, and employment had fallen sharply, and the unemployment rate had risen to 9%. Meanwhile, consumer price inflation, which had been around 3% to 4% earlier in the decade, soared to 10% during my senior year. The oil price shock of the 1970s began in October 1973, when in response to the Yom Kippur War, Arab oil producers imposed an embargo on oil exports. Before the embargo in 1972, the price of imported oil was about $3.20 a barrel. By 1975, the average price was $14 a barrel, more than 4 times greater. President Nixon had imposed economy-wide controls on wages and prices in 1971, including prices of petroleum products. In November 1973, in the wake of the embargo, the president placed additional controls on petroleum prices. As basic economics predicts, when a scarce resource cannot be determined by market-determined prices, it will be allocated in some other way. In this case, in what became the iconic symbol of the times, in long lines at gasoline stations. In 1974, in an attempt to overcome the unintended consequences of price controls, drivers in many places were permitted to buy gasoline only on odd or even days of the month, depending on the last digit of their license plate number. Moreover, with the controlled price of U.S. crude oil well below world prices, growth in domestic exploration slowed and production was curtailed, which of course only made things worse. In addition to creating long lines at gasoline stations, the oil price shock exacerbated what was already an intensifying buildup of inflation and inflation expectations. In another echo of today, the inflationary situation was worsened by rapidly rising prices of agricultural products and other commodities. Economists generally agree that monetary policy performed poorly during this period. In part, this was because policymakers, in choosing what they believed to be the appropriate setting for monetary policy, overestimated the productive capacity of the economy. I'll have more to say about this shortly. Federal Reserve policymakers also underestimated both their own contributions to the inflationary problems of the time and their ability to curb that inflation. For example, On occasion, they blamed inflation on so-called cost-push factors, such as union wage pressures and price increases by large market-dominating firms. However, the abilities of some firms and unions to push through inflationary wage and price increases were symptoms of the problem, not the underlying cause. Several years passed before the Federal Reserve gained a new leadership that better understood the central bank's role in the inflation process and that understood that sustained anti-inflationary monetary policies would actually work. Beginning in 1979, such policies were implemented successfully, although not without significant costs in terms of lost output and employment, under Fed Chairman Paul Volcker. For the Federal Reserve, two crucial lessons from this experience were, first, that high inflation can seriously destabilize an economy, and second, that the central bank must take responsibility for achieving price stability over the medium term. Fast forward now to 2003. In that year, crude oil cost a little more than $30 per barrel. Since then, crude oil prices have increased more than fourfold, proportionally about the same as in the 1970s. Now, as in 1975, adjusting to such high prices for crude has been painful. Gas prices around $4 per gallon are a huge burden for many households, as well as for truckers, manufacturers, farmers, and others. But in many other ways, the economic consequences have been quite different from those in the 1970s. One obvious difference is what you don't see. Drivers lining up on odd or even days to buy gasoline because of price controls, or signs at gas stations that say, "No gas." And until the recent slowdown, which is more the result of conditions in housing and financial markets than of higher oil prices, economic growth was solid and unemployment remained low, unlike we saw after the oil price increases of the 1970s. For a central banker, a particularly critical difference between then and now is what has happened to inflation and inflation expectations. The overall inflation rate has averaged about 3.5% over the past 4 quarters, significantly higher than we would like, but much less than the double-digit rates that inflation reached in the mid-1970s and then again in 1980. Moreover, the increase in inflation has been milder this time, on the order of 1 percentage point over the past year, as compared with the 6 percentage point jump that followed the 1973 oil price shock. From the perspective of monetary policy, just as important as the behavior of actual inflation is what households and businesses expect to happen to inflation in the future, particularly over the longer term. If people expect an increase in inflation to be temporary and do not build it into their long-term plans for setting wages and prices, then the inflation created by a shock to oil prices will tend to fade relatively quickly. Some indicators of longer-term inflation expectations have risen in recent months, which is a significant concern for the Federal Reserve. We will need to monitor that situation closely. However, changes in longer-term inflation expectations have been measured in tenths of a percentage point this time around, rather than in whole percentage points, as appeared to be the case in the mid-1970s. Importantly, we see little indication today of the beginnings of a 1970s-style wage-price spiral in which wages and prices chased each other ever upward. A good deal of economic research has looked at the question of why the inflation response to the oil shock has been relatively muted in the current instance. One factor, which illustrates my point about the adaptability and flexibility of the U.S. economy, is the pronounced decline in the energy intensity of our economy since about 1975. Since then, the energy required to produce a given amount of output in the U.S. economy has fallen by about half. This great improvement in energy efficiency was less the result of government programs than of steps taken by households and businesses in response to higher energy prices, including substantial investments in more energy-efficient equipment and means of transportation. This improvement in energy efficiency is one of the reasons why a given increase in crude oil prices does less damage to the U.S. economy today than it did in the 1970s. Another reason is the performance of monetary policy. The Federal Reserve and other central banks have learned the lessons of the 1970s. Because monetary policy works with a lag, the short-term inflationary effects of a sharp increase in oil prices can generally not be fully offset. However, since Paul Volcker's time, the Federal Reserve has been firmly committed to maintaining a low and stable rate of inflation over the longer term. And we recognize that keeping longer-term inflation expectations well anchored is essential to achieving this goal of low and stable inflation. Maintaining the confidence in the Fed's commitment to price stability remains a top priority as the central bank navigates the current complex situation. Although our economy has thus far dealt with the current oil price shock comparatively well, the United States and the rest of the world still face significant challenges in coping with the rising global demand for energy, especially if continued demand growth and constrained supplies maintain the intense pressure on prices. The silver lining of higher energy prices is that they provide a powerful incentive for action, for conservation, including investment in energy-saving technologies, for the investment needed to bring new oil supplies to market, and for the development of new conventional and non-conventional energy sources. The government, in addition to the market, can usefully address energy concerns, for example, by supporting basic research and adopting well-designed regulatory policies to promote important social objectives, such as protecting the environment. As we saw after the oil price shock of the 1970s, given some time, the economy can become much more energy efficient, even as it continues to grow and living standards improve. Let me turn now to the other economic challenge I want to highlight today, the productivity performance of our economy. At this point, you may be saying to yourself, is it too late to book Ali G? However, anyone who stayed awake through Ec 10 knows why this subject is important. As Adam Smith pointed out in 1776, in the long run, more than any other factor, the productivity of the workforce determines the nation's standard of living. The decades following World War II were remarkable for their industrial innovation and creativity. From 1948 to 1973, output per hour of work grew by about 3% per year on average. But then, for the next 20 years or so, productivity growth averaged only about 1.5% per year, about half the previous rate. Predictably, the rate of increase in the standard of living slowed as well, to about the same extent. The difference between 3% and 1.5% may not sound like much, but at 3% per year, the standard of living would double about every 23 years, or about once every generation. And by contrast, at 1.5%, a doubling would occur only roughly every 47 years, or once every other generation. Among the many consequences of the productivity slowdown was a further complication for the monetary policymakers of the 1970s. Detecting shifts in economic trends is difficult in real time, and most economists and policymakers did not fully appreciate the extent of the productivity slowdown until the late 1970s. This further influenced the policymakers of the time toward running a monetary policy that was too accommodative. The resulting overheating of the economy probably exacerbated the inflation problems of that decade. Productivity growth revived in the mid-1990s, as I mentioned, illustrating once again the resilience of the American economy. Since 1995, productivity has increased about a 2.5% annual rate. A great deal of intellectual effort has been expended in trying to explain the recent performance and to forecast the future performance of productivity. Much very good work has been conducted here at Harvard by Dale Jorgensen, who was my senior thesis advisor in 1975, by the way, and by his colleagues. and other important research in this area has been done at the Federal Reserve Board. One key finding of the research is that to have an economic impact, technological innovations must be translated into successful commercial applications. This country's competitive market-based system, its flexible capital and labor markets, its tradition of entrepreneurship, and its technological strengths, to which Harvard and other universities make a critical contribution, help to ensure that this happens on an ongoing basis. While private sector initiative was the key ingredient in generating the pickup in productivity growth, government policy was constructive, in part through basic research support, but also to a substantial degree by promoting economic competition. Beginning in the late 1970s, the federal government deregulated a number of industries, including air travel, trucking, telecommunications, and energy. The resulting increase in competition promoted cost reductions and innovation, leading in turn to new products and new industries. It's difficult to imagine that we would have online retailing today if the transportation and telecommunications industries had not been deregulated. In addition, the lowering of trade barriers increased productivity gains by increasing competition, expanding markets, and increasing the pace of technology transfer. And finally, as a central banker, I would be remiss if I failed to mention the contribution of monetary policy to the improved productivity performance. By damping business cycles and by keeping inflation under control, a sound monetary policy improves the ability of households and firms to plan and increases their willingness to undertake the investments in skills, research, and physical capital needed to support continuing gains in productivity. Just as the productivity slowdown was associated with a slower growth of real per capita income, the productivity resurgence since the mid-1990s has been accompanied by a pickup in real income growth. One measure of average living standards, real consumption per capita, is nearly 35% higher today than in 1995. In addition, the flood of innovation that helped spur the productivity resurgence has created many new jobs opportunities and quite a few fortunes as well. But changing technology has also reduced job opportunities for some others, bank tellers and assembly line workers, for example. And that is the crux of a whole new set of challenges. Even though average economic well-being has increased considerably over time, the degree of inequality in economic outcomes over the past 3 decades has increased as well. Economists continue to grapple with the reasons for this trend. But the best we can tell, the increase in inequality is probably due to a number of factors, notably including technological change that seems to have favored higher skilled workers over lower skilled ones. In addition, some economists point to increased international trade and the declining role of labor unions as other but possibly lesser contributing factors. What should we do about rising economic inequality? Answering this question inevitably involves difficult value judgments and trade-offs. But approaches that inhibit the dynamism of our economy would clearly be a step in the wrong direction. To be sure, new technologies and increased international trade can lead to painful dislocations as some workers lose their jobs or see the demand for their skills decrease. However, hindering the adoption of new technologies or inhibiting trade flows would do far more harm than good over the long haul. In the short term, the better approach is to adopt policies that help those who are displaced by economic change. By doing so, we not only provide assistance to those who need it, but help to provide public support for the economic flexibility that is so essential for prosperity. In the long term, however, the best way by far to improve economic opportunity and to reduce inequality is to increase the educational attainment and skills of American workers. The productivity surge in the decades after World War II corresponded to a period in which educational attainment was increasing rapidly. In recent decades, progress on that front has been far slower. Moreover, inequalities in education and in access to education remain high. As we think about improving education and skills, we should also look beyond the traditional K-12 and four-year college system, as important as that is, to recognize that education can be lifelong and take many forms. Early childhood education, community colleges, vocational schools, on-the-job training, online courses, adult education, all of these are vehicles of demonstrated value in increasing skills and earning power. The use of a wide range of methods to address the pressing problem of inadequate skills and economic inequality would be entirely consistent with the themes of economic adaptability and flexibility that I've emphasized in my remarks. I'll close by shifting from the topic of education in general to your education specifically, class of 2008. Through effort, talent, and doubtless some luck, you have succeeded in acquiring an excellent education. Your education, more precisely, your ability to think critically and creatively, is your greatest asset. And unlike many assets, the more you draw on it, the faster it grows. Put it to good use. The poor forecasting record of economists is legendary, but I'm going to make a forecast of which I'm very confident. Whatever you expect your life and work to be like 10, 20, or 30 years from now, the reality will be quite different. In looking over the 30th anniversary report of my own class, I was struck by the great diversity of vocations and avocations that have engaged my classmates. To be sure, the volume was full of attorneys and physicians and professors, as well as architects, engineers, editors, bankers, and even a few economists. Many listed the title vice president, and not a few listed the title president. But the class of 1975 also included those who listed their occupations as composer, environmental advocate, musician, playwright, rabbi, conflict resolution coach, painter, community organizer, and essayist. And even for those of us with more conventional job descriptions, the nature of our daily work and its relationship to our economy and to our society is, I am sure, very different from what we might have guessed in 1975. My point is only that you cannot predict your path. You can only try to be as prepared as possible for the opportunities as well as for the disappointments that will surely come your way. For people, as for economies, adaptability and flexibility count for a great deal. Wherever your path leads, I hope you use your considerable talents and energy in endeavors that engage and excite you and benefit not only yourselves, but also in some measure your country and your world. Today, I wish you and your families a day of joyous celebration. Congratulations, class of 2008. Thank you.